Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased today to welcome you all to the JNCC Natural Capital Showcase Series. My name is Deanna Donovan, the environmental economist here at JNCC, and your host for this webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Refugia and Rising Temperatures, Climate Change Challenges to Biodiversity. Despite COVID-19 seeming to dominate the stage these days, a much larger threat awaits in the wings, namely climate change. Climate change threatens the world's major centers of biodiversity and jeopardizes many conservation and development efforts worldwide. The Wallace Initiative, a multi-institutional partnership, models and maps the projected impacts of climate change on terrestrial biodiversity. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Jeff Price, the coordinator of the Wallace Initiative, who will introduce the methodology and findings of the initiative scientists. Preliminary results highlight the projected impacts of climate change on critical natural capital, indicating where biodiversity hotspots may exist in the future, where disease vectors might shift, and how patterns of agricultural production might change. Perhaps this information can provide guidance as to where the best areas are to conserve or to restore under different climate scenarios. Today's presentation is scheduled to last about an hour and will be followed by a Q&A period of 20 to 30 minutes. My very able technical assistants will be Joe and Adam. If participants online encounter any problems, please contact Joe directly through the chat function on the webinar system for assistance. Also, if you have questions, please use the chat line to log them and we will present them to the speaker at the end of the presentation. Now, before leaving the floor, let me briefly introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Price is a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and associate professor of biodiversity and climate change at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of East Anglia. Prior to this, he was managing director for climate change adaptation for the World Wildlife Fund USA. Among other things, he has been lead author on several IPCC assessment reports, and as contributing author on the 5th assessment report, shares in the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. And now, Jeff, I hand over to you.
Thank you. The Wallace Initiative is actually at the Tyndall Center, but we work very closely with our colleagues in Australia where all the computing was done. Principally, it's myself, Professor Rachel Warren from the Tyndall Center, Nicole Forstenhausler, who's just started her PhD, but is our ACE-R programmer at the moment. Dr. Aaron Graham and Professor Ian Atkinson at James Cook University, and Professor Jeremy Vanderwall, who is sort of retired to Canada, but was one of the keystones in Australia throughout the Wallace Initiative. We've examined approximately 130,000 terrestrial species, fungi, plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates. This is at a spatial resolution of 20 kilometers, looking at warming levels of 1.5 degrees to 6 degrees C. We looked at 21 general circulation model patterns so we can capture as wide a range of uncertainty as possible. And this was done both looking at species with and without dispersal using what we term realistic dispersal rates, which come from the literature. The work I'm presenting here today will primarily be with no dispersal. And the reason for that is that while dispersal is beneficial for the survival of single species, when you start talking about areas, you then have to deal with community transformation and community disruption potentially with dispersal. However, during the question session, if there are questions about the dispersal, I can show a new metric which we use, the Community Transformation Index, to show how much dispersal could disrupt communities globally. The modeling took more than 1 million hours of computing time and took up more than 1 petabyte of storage. So when people ask us, well, couldn't you do X or Y? The answer is generally no. We did as much as we could. So unless Amazon or Google is going to come forward and offer major cloud resources, this is about as far as we're going to be able to go at the moment. The output from the Wallace Initiative, and this is for each climate model and for each warming level, is in essence a probability or a likelihood surface. It's not a crystal ball. It is a projection, but in essence, it's a projection of a probability or a likelihood. And so it should be viewed as a hypothesis of future change, not actually as what will happen. It's something that allows you to build monitoring schemes, and it allows you to build it into conservation plans in the absence of other data. In particular, it was designed to allow the examination of what I call no regret scenarios, trying to identify those areas that are beneficial for biodiversity now, that the models would say remain beneficial for those species into the future, as opposed to trying to guess where species may or may not be able to move, especially in a highly fragmented landscape. So basically what these future projections are for species or for areas are projected climate suitability and or projected climate unsuitability for the species. We have done substantial amounts of cross-validation, bootstrapping, comparing with other results. You can look at the results from Urban et al., which was published in Science. This goes back to our Nature Climate Change paper as opposed to our more recent Science paper. He compared that with Wendy Foden's work, with work from DGPMs and others. We essentially come up with very similar results, and this isn't a surprise because it all ties to the same climate models. So this is the home screen of wallaceinitiative.org. It comes up saying that it's still in beta test, if you will, or even alpha test, and it is and probably always will be because individual species models and maps can be tweaked or corrected, and particular issues with taxonomy and name changes can come into play. But if you go further, this shows what an individual species map looks like. This is the map for chocolate, Theobroma cacao, looking at the current modeled climate suitability. This is when it's on the left-hand screen or now. And as the slider drags across, you're looking at the potential suitability for chocolate under the current Paris pledges, which gets us to approximately 3 degrees of warming. So while the Paris goals are to come in at 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible, the reality is we're still looking at somewhere between 2.7 and 3.7 degrees of warming under the pledges, assuming the governments actually do something, and depending on the sensitivity of the climate. And even with COVID-19, even with all the press around the big drop in emissions, the press today shows that air pollution levels in China are already back to normal. And even if it stayed at that level, it would not have made a huge difference overall, but it would have made a small difference and a small start. But if you like chocolate, then it becomes much more difficult to grow chocolate in chocolate growing regions in the future. And this has been backed up with many other studies looking at chocolate in many other ways, and doesn't even take into account both chocolate pollinators, the chocolate midge, which we have not modeled because it's very difficult to find, so we don't have good distributions. And it does not take into account the taste of chocolate, which has been projected to become more bitter with warming. In 2018, we published a paper in Science looking at the projected effects on insects, vertebrates, and plants, looking at 1.5 versus 2 degrees. And basically at 3 degrees of warming, 3.2 degrees in this case, we are projected to see losses of up to 50% of the range and approximately 50% of the insects. So approximately half the insects losing half of their range. And the loss of half of the range has been the metric we always use. It's simply a metric we chose. There's no a priori reason. We also have data on 75% loss and 90% loss. But it's approximately the threshold used in the fourth assessment report, as well as to how severe something is. In a more recent work by Brian Ingvest and others, they also look at loss of half the range. But with 2 degrees of warming, only 18% of the insects are projected to lose half their range. And with 1.5 degrees of warming, this drops to 6% of the insects. So basically, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees avoids 2/3 of the risks of range contraction in insects due to climate change, as warming at 2 degrees does. Looking at plants, which is the largest group we've modeled, at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees C is that approximately half the risks associated with warming are avoided by coming in at 1.5 versus 2 degrees. And to be honest, this was somewhat of a surprise to us. We looked at 1.5 degrees in part because it was driven by the policymakers, in part because Bayes wanted us to. We could easily look at it from the model runs we had already done. We really didn't expect that 0.5 degree would make a huge difference, but we found out that in fact it does make a very large difference. And depending on the taxa you're looking at, where the tipping point is, has a geographic component, but it also has a temperature component. And so you see a fairly major shift between 2 and 3 degrees and between 3 and 4 degrees. But for vertebrates, it tends to be closer to 3 degrees. Plants is a little bit closer to 2 degrees. And for insects, it's closer to 1.5 degrees. And this is particularly true even when you look at the UK, which I'll show you later in this talk. With vertebrates, again, about half of the risks are avoided at 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, but you see that there are actually far fewer risks overall to vertebrates, and this is heavily weighted by birds in our modeling. But the goal of the Wallace Initiative was always to identify refugia, looking for the ARCs, the no regret scenarios. Where should we be prioritizing our conservation efforts? So we look at refugia as being any area remaining climatically suitable for more than 75% of the species modeled. Again, this was taken somewhat from IUCN guidelines and somewhat as just we had to choose a threshold. And by choosing a threshold like 75%, it allows us actually to present maps showing how many climate models are in agreement that an area is a refugia or not. We start out with looking at areas as macro refugia. These are defined by climate exposure, the probability of species loss, and the spatial resolution is 20 kilometers. We don't even attempt to model at less than 20 kilometers. While there are data sets out there, most notably WorldClim, we feel that there are real issues with the data set as you go smaller than 20 kilometers, and there are statistical issues with pushing thin plate spline smoothing to high resolution as well. And in fact, Hutchinson, the developer of thin plate spline smoothing, recommends that you don't take it down even to 10 kilometers unless you have substantial amounts of underlying data to drive the interpolation process. When you have an island like Madagascar with only 24 weather stations, it's hard to see how you can justify interpolating to 1 kilometer. Indeed, when you look at the data, at least for WorldClim 1.1, what you see is that it does not capture lapse rate. And yet, at a resolution of 1 kilometer, when you're looking at a montane region, you should see differences in distribution on the wetter and drier sides of the mountain owing to the lapse rate. So looking at 1 kilometer at the model level, because of flaws in precipitation and lapse rate, would give you a misleading representation of what the world might look like, but the maps look really good. However, lapse rate is not likely to change with climate change. It's a physical parameter. And so higher elevations will always be cooler, lower elevations will always be warmer. And we've developed a technique called elevational downscaling, which allows us to take this down to 1 kilometer simply by looking at the difference owing to elevation and how much cooler or warmer the area may be. We actually call this more of a buffering surface, areas that may persist longer or not persist as long as climate change increases. But realizing that refugia are those areas that are climatically suitable for greater than 75%, and areas of concern, which I won't talk about here, or sometimes called areas of ecosystem collapse, are areas becoming climatically unsuitable for more than 75%, means that there is a very large span between 25% and 75% of an area, where 25 to 75% of the species will be impacted. This will undoubtedly have fairly major natural capital and biodiversity impacts, but it's not a refugia. So we look at that using species richness remaining. We're in the process of translating this into something called natural capital risk, Wallace NC for Wallace Natural Capital, where it's taking all of these values at the level of species richness as opposed to at the level of refugia, and using them as much as possible against the various levels of natural capital. So we can cover things like, why might you see increased flood risk, or might you see reduced carbon storage if you see a reduction in plant species richness in an area. But it's very easy to look at things like pollination and pollinator risk, and the factor that into basically food provisioning as well as part of the natural capital risk register and Wallace NC. So now getting on to the maps. You can look at things in an ideal world, and in many respects, our papers in science and nature, climate change, look at this sort of real ideal world, which is, this is merely places with suitable climate. So this is the species richness remaining of birds at 2 degrees C based on climate alone. So it assumes that there is some sort of habitat there. It doesn't take into account ice. It doesn't take into account deserts. It doesn't take into account cities. The wide areas in this case are largely no data as opposed to ice. But this shows the difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees. And so you can see the large increase in the red areas where you've had major loss of species richness. This is particularly in the areas currently called the Kalahari Desert, but also parts of India, for example, and the Amazon. But that's not the real world. The real world has been heavily modified. So we currently are working using the satellite-derived land cover data from the ESA Climate Change Initiative. The data I'll be showing here use the 2015 land cover data. We're currently beginning to work with the 2018 layers, but we're finding that while they're supposed to be the same, it is a different satellite sensor, and the data do not necessarily completely match up, particularly in higher latitudes or areas that would have a lot of ice or cloud cover. So again, here's the ideal world for birds. But if instead we now look at what happens with land cover, the dark brown are all bare ground regions. The wide areas outside of Siberia and Greenland are actually agriculture in this case. So much of India, which would still have fairly high species richness, turn white because it's been converted to agriculture. The lighter areas, sort of the light green within North America, southern Brazil, most of Europe, most of East Anglia, those are areas that are still somewhat natural, but greater than 50% agriculture. So I didn't actually classify these as white, as not being suitable for biodiversity. It does have some biodiversity, but it has much lower levels of biodiversity because it's much lower levels of natural land. The resolution of this now is at 300 meters. So I've resampled the data to 300 meters to match the land cover data. And in this case, this is the jump from 1.5 to 3 degrees. And you're seeing, again, much of Southern Africa outside of the fynbos and the karoo becoming unsuitable for large number of species of birds. We can take various maps if we make assumptions and say, well, if an area is suitable as a refugia for more than half of the climate models, so in this case, 11 to 21 climate models, we can then overlay the maps and we can make much more complex maps or matrices. And so this shows areas that are considered refugia for plants from 1.5 to 4 degrees for half of the climate models. And you see that across Central and Western Africa, many of those areas would stay refugia at 3 to 4 degrees. Parts of what used to be the tall grass prairies in North America or in the US, much of northern the UK, much of Norway, all stay refugia for plants at 4 degrees, and then the Tibetan Plateau. And as you would expect, as you get up into higher elevation regions, you tend to find refugia at higher temperatures. Now the maps get very complex, so we'll take a few minutes to really understand this before moving on to other countries. This map shows the areas that could be considered refugia, at least climate refugia for plants, between 1.5 and 4 degrees in both natural areas, as in these are areas which you could expand the protected area network, or you could prioritize conservation, and areas that have been converted usually to agriculture. And these are the areas that are marked as restore. So in this map, this highly complex map, sort of that tan area, that's bare ground. That's desert in this case. We won't pay attention to that. But the areas that are light green, and there aren't many in Ethiopia, are refugia only at 1.5 degrees. The areas that are sort of a leafy green are refugia at 1.5 and 2 degrees. The areas that are darker green are natural areas that are climatic refugia at 1.5, 2, and 3 degrees. And the purple areas in this case are refugia all the way to 4 degrees. Many of these areas are in the Ethiopian highlands, particularly the highest areas. So these are places where the models show as remaining climatically suitable for greater than 75% of the species modeled. But areas that have been lost and could be restored are in brown. So those areas in dark brown are refugia only at 1.5 degrees. But when you start getting up to orange, yellow, or blue, particularly blue, these are areas that would be climatic refugia at 4 degrees. So they're very powerful arcs, if you will, or very powerful refugia, but they've been converted to other uses, principally agriculture, and principally in the highlands. In this map, the white areas are the boundaries of the protected areas within Ethiopia. So you can see in sort of the bottom of Ethiopia, and I can't get an arrow to come up, you have a protected area that's largely sky blue. So what that means is that the majority of that protected area is not natural habitat at all. It's already been converted to agriculture in some way. And therefore, if you want that protected area to act as a climate refugia at 4 degrees, this is an area to prioritize restoration. So as we're moving into the decade of restoration from 2021 to 2030, as we're beginning to talk about plans within the Convention of Biological Diversity of setting aside 20% or 30% as protected areas, we can't pretend that climate change is not a threat. And we should be looking at where can we prioritize the restoration activities. And this is restoring not necessarily to trees, but just back to the natural habitat that it was. If in this case you're looking at the purple areas and you start prioritizing restoration in the blue areas surrounding that, then it makes it easier for species to be able to expand their range and expand the size of their refugia. If you're talking about restoring areas that are a long way from other natural areas, then colonization events will become much more difficult and corridors will become much more important. This next slide is simply zooming in on the Ethiopian highlands. And in this case, and this is the only slide where I show them, the purple areas, the purple lines are key biodiversity areas. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that a key biodiversity area does not necessarily mean it has large numbers of species. It means that it is important for key biodiversity. These could be a few endemics, a few rare species, a few threatened species. So it's not necessarily high species richness. But nevertheless, what you see is that many of these key biodiversity areas are either dark gray, meaning it's not a refugia at all, even at 1.5 degrees, or are in the restore category. And so are areas that would need to be restored in order to benefit the key biodiversity that they've been identified for. This table breaks down that Ethiopia overall at 1.5 degrees, approximately 72% of the land area of Ethiopia will be identified as a climate refugia. But of that, 58% is in natural areas and 14% is in agricultural areas or areas to restore. As the temperature goes up, if you start reaching 2 degrees, or particularly if you reach 3 degrees, well, now you're only looking at 12% natural and 7% being in agriculture. So you've halved the amount of agricultural land beneficial as refugia, but you've lost substantially higher numbers of natural areas potentially as refugia. This really shouldn't be a surprise because people move first agriculture into areas with slightly more stable climates. You don't want to be growing food in areas where you have common drought frequently, for example. If you look at the percentage of the KBAs, so the KBA identified for Ethiopia is approximately 12.8% of the area of Ethiopia. At 2 degrees, 54% of that is natural, but 20% would benefit from restoration. And as you go up to 2 and 3 degrees, then again, the number drops. And when you look at the percentage of protected areas, Ethiopia, at least in our analysis, shows that approximately 20.4% of the country is protected. So meeting the Aichi targets, the CBD 2020 targets. However, of that, at 2 degrees, only 65% of it is still a refugia at 1.5 degrees, and only 12% at 3 degrees. And in fact, you would have to restore all of the potential refugia at 3 degrees, which is agriculture, to even reach to maintain the Aichi targets. So with warming, the CBD targets become harder and harder to maintain, even if they're reached. So when we talk about bending the curve for biodiversity, bending the curve or stopping loss isn't enough. We have to be looking at how biodiversity is likely to react to climate change. And one of the flaws in the thinking of many development organizations and indeed many conservation organizations is what we do is enough. What we do is often not enough. If we simply try to do what we have always done, set aside land, just do good conservation, just remove other stressors, and we don't take into account what might happen at 1.5, 2 or 3 degrees, or 4 degrees, or higher at 6 degrees, then we're simply putting money into areas that may fail, or we may not be putting money into areas which could be very beneficial for greater conservation. So moving on to other areas, Deanna gave me a list of countries and places that would be of interest. I'm showing some of them here, but I actually have done all of them, and we can look at them in questions if people want to know. But in terms of migratory birds, many of the migratory birds for the UK winter in West Africa. So here we show West Africa. Ghana is outlined in black because we'll be zooming in on there in a minute. What you see is what would seem to be a large area of natural land that's refugia. And you might say, well, this is very positive, except that area is all semi-arid. And at best, it's savanna. In many cases, it's actually semi-arid desert. These aren't the places where paleotropical birds are wintering. They tend to be wintering in the rainforests, and the remaining rainforests are those areas that are largely orange. So as we zoom into Ghana, for example, the southern part of Ghana, that big band which is mostly orange, which would be refugia at 2 degrees, much of that historically was rainforest and is now agriculture. Those green areas for 2 degrees are all that remain of much of the rainforest of various types in Ghana. And many of those areas are only green, and they're all because they are in protected areas. And many of those protected areas are currently threatened. So for example, the Atewa Range in Ghana, which is a key headwater for water for all of the people who live in Accra, is basically being given to the Chinese, sold to the Chinese, to allow them to mine bauxite. And this removes then that rainforest and removes that key component of headwater. So the natural capital risk is astronomical in terms of bauxite mining in this one particular region. So it's not enough to look and say, well, look, this is natural habitat. You have to know natural habitat for what and what your priorities are. So while places like Mole National Park in the northern part of the country, at least for plants, is a refugia at 2 and even at 3 degrees, it has nowhere near the overall species richness and biodiversity of the places like Ankasa in the southern part of the country, in the rainforest regions. Sumatra shows much of the same patterns that you see elsewhere. Areas that are highland come across as being purple. In this case, they're still natural. They're still refugia at high temperatures. Many of these areas are still intact simply because they're difficult to get to. The same thing is true for New Guinea and for Papua as well. As you get down into the lowlands, many of those areas have already been converted, often for oil palm. And many of these areas could be refugia if they're restored, but the refugia is only to about 2 degrees C. Moving to Malaysia, much of Malaysia is actually not a refugia, even at 1.5 degrees. But as you move into the highlands, it's still refugia natural at 4. You've got some patches that are light blue, which would be the places to prioritize restoration. And again, this is mostly looking specifically at plants. You have some refugia at 1.5 degrees moving forward. As part of the elevational downscaling and as part of a project for bays, we actually worked through our models and ran curves through them to look at what might happen at 1 degrees and 0.5 degree to try to find where the tipping points are. And I can't say where it is for Malaysia, but what I can say is for the Amazon, we would appear to essentially be there, at least according to our models. We're somewhere between around 1 degree is where you go from being a refugia to not being a refugia. But remember, refugia are those areas remaining climatically suitable for more than 75% of the species. So many of these areas in dark green are still good for large numbers of species, but it's usually between 50% and 75%. It hasn't crossed that 75% threshold to be a climatic refugia or to be an ARC. India is an area where you've got large areas that aren't refugia at all, but you also have extensive areas that have been lost due to agricultural production. So in southern India, you've got the Western Ghats, and much of that highland region, if you zoom in, is fragmented, but is still natural and climatic refugia. but much of the central part of the country is not. And so if we zoom in here, we can see parts of the Western Ghats. These are the protected areas outlined in purple. But you can see these large areas that are this orange shading, which would be refugia at 2 degrees, but have been lost to agriculture. And so if you were to prioritize restoration activities, both from natural capital point of view and biodiversity conservation, then prioritizing those brown areas or those orange areas that are immediately surrounding or adjoining the green areas would be the better move in terms of trying to do biodiversity conservation than being in the middle of a brown area in general. So countries need to think about how climate change might impact the biodiversity as they're thinking about expanding their protected area network. And in fact, several years ago, I was asked to examine Colombia's potential expansions of the protected areas and found that most of them would not benefit biodiversity at all in terms of climate change. It benefits biodiversity now. Having more area and having buffer zones is something you always want. But in terms of which areas would be also refugia, largely the buffer zones were at lower elevations and would be less likely to act as refugia, but would act in a tremendous way in order to reduce other human pressures. But here's a case where if you look at more northern India, this is the Ranipur Tiger Reserve, is that area that's actually marked in sort of lavender. And of it, it's currently about half natural vegetation and about half converted to agriculture. And surrounding it entirely is areas that potentially could be refugia even at 4 degrees. So looking at an expansion of the protected area network with restoration into this part of India would actually benefit a large amount of biodiversity, including tigers, because the tigers are currently largely in the tiger reserve. So moving on to the UK and moving on to other taxa as well. This is the same map as before, the red showing the large number of protected areas, and this includes things like wildlife trust properties, RSPB reserves. And what you see in this part of England and southern England and into Wales is what you see in many of the other parts is that you essentially, if you draw a line from Cardiff up to say about Hull, everything southeast of that, you're looking at a tipping point of somewhere around 2 degrees. And for warming levels of higher than 2 degrees, and certainly up to 4 degrees, you either need to get higher in elevation, more over to Wales, or further north. But even at that, if you look at East Anglia, what you're seeing are much of that is agriculture. And much of this is arable farmland. And it could be refugia for plants, but in fact is already being used for food production. Yes, areas that are along roadside verges, if they're not being cut, areas that are edges of fields, shelter belts all provide biodiversity habitat, but nowhere near what it could. So trying to develop large tracts which are conserved, the idea of land sparing versus land sharing, in this case, trying to come up with larger areas that are protected and still maintaining the verges and corridors would be important. But what I'm showing here, and you can only do this at one temperature, so whereas this map shows the potential for refugia at temperatures up to 4 degrees, if we concentrate on a single temperature, like 2 degrees, we can look at, well, how many taxa could it be a refugia for? And in this case, what we're looking at is plants, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds. So that's the 5. And so that scale that runs 1 to 5, from sort of a light green to blue, is showing the number of taxa that the area would be a refugia for that's still natural. So much of Wales, for example, would still be a refugia for all 5 taxa at 2 degrees. But if you talk about areas that have been converted, then what you see is East Anglia potentially could be a refugia for all 5 taxa, had it not already been converted to farmland. And with restoration, we know from work from RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, and others, you can actually rapidly recover at least certain components of biodiversity in these areas. Those that are dark brown tend to be for 4 of the 5 taxa. And you're still going to benefit the 5th taxa, but just not at 75% level. But here comes the wrinkle: insects. Insects would appear from the models to be far more sensitive than vertebrates and plants. And indeed, from the other literature around what observed impacts we've already been seeing, that appears to be the case, that insects are more sensitive to warming than are vertebrates and plants. And so if you look at Refugia for invertebrates, so Refugia for insects at 2 degrees, it actually doesn't occur in much of southwestern England, but it still occurs in Wales and obviously further north and in the Peak District. And moreover, when you look at pollinators, and this is a case where looking at Refugia, the way the Refugia originally designed to be looked at, there's a number of climate models in agreement that the area is a refugia for pollinators, because this is at 2 degrees C. What you see is there are areas within East Anglia that are climate refugia for pollinators for fairly high numbers. But in much of the UK, very few models agree that at 2 degrees, it's a refugia for pollinators. So you're now looking at real problems when it comes to natural capital and food production. If you're talking about crops that require pollination or crops that give increased yield with pollination, particularly those that are pollinated by wild pollinators, you're looking at a threshold of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees, in which case at which point you're looking at fairly significant impacts, not only to wild species, but also to agriculture. So those are the maps that I have prepared to show as part of the talk. I have also with me maps for Namibia, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Central Africa, Borneo, and Sulawesi, should there be questions afterwards. And there will be plenty of time for questions. So I want to close with talking about something called Wallace's Parks. And this comes from the whole concept of trying to identify protected areas as arcs, both as arcs for the future, so protected areas where we need to set protected areas aside, and also how well will current protected areas be able to persist under climate change. So we have devised a computer routine which will mine through several thousand raster layers and automatically generate a report on the observed climate, the projected climate change, and the projected biodiversity change for every protected area on Earth. For these protected areas, the report provides the observed climate from 1961 to 1990 and 1986 to 2015. So you've got 2 30-year time periods and can show how much the climate has changed between the two. The number of years in that period that have been greater than 2 standard deviations different from this 30-year average as being somewhat of a natural adaptation threshold. We then show projections for 1.5, 2 degrees, 2.7 degrees, 3.2 degrees, and 4.5 degrees of warming. We show the percent of years in the future that exceed 2 standard deviations. And we also show the 1 kilometer buffered climate. In other words, what's the difference between looking at how elevational differences occur in that area, both positive and negative. We look at changes in population, both current and projected through 2100 in and around the park. So we look at a buffer area. We look at how much land use change, what land cover change there has been between 1992 and 2015 for each protected area in the buffer zone. And we looked at projected biodiversity changes at a 1 kilometer level. So we look at basically change in species richness, species at risk. We looked at the percent of the area, which is a climate refugia. We looked at percent species remaining. And we look at something which we call the adaptation effort. The adaptation effort is a metric which allows an assessment as to whether current conservation practices alone or with slight modifications would be adequate, whether you need to make substantial changes to conservation management in order to allow the current taxa to adapt, or in some cases, many situations where you should be looking at facilitating change. In other words, the projected climate changes and the sensitivity is so high that the area is likely to convert to a different habitat type, where you're going to see many different species there, and therefore working through corridors, working to allow the species to move and to get new community types would be the most beneficial adaptation. This has been a very hard point to get through to conservation organizations. When you start talking about adaptation, everybody thinks about maintaining the status quo and getting them to realize that you may not be able to maintain the status quo in many areas. The analyses have been completed for all of the parks in the Bahamas, Belize, Botswana, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ethiopia, Ghana, Haiti, Hungary, Jamaica, Kenya, Madagascar, New Guinea, Papua, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Sweden, Trinidad and Tobago, and Uganda. These will first be released as Tyndall working papers, including one on the methodology, which will be the first Tyndall working paper of this, and summaries for at least some of them will be submitted to journals. And in fact, one of the reasons there's so many islands in this list is that the small island authors on the small island states chapter for IPCC wanted to work on a paper looking at potential burning embers or risks to terrestrial biodiversity on these islands. So thank you for your attention, and I will turn it over to questions.
And thank you very much, Jeff. I've fascinating talk, and an immense amount of work is clearly there. Let me get one first question. With regard to those papers you just said were going to be released, is there any time frame on that? Do you know when they might be coming out?
In terms of the working papers, I hope to get some of them out this summer. In terms of the reports that have been generated, I'm happy to share the data that are in the reports. So I'm happy to share the reports with basically the rough text, which has already been written for the reports. The reports themselves have a wrapper text, which explain both how to read the reports and also has an appendix. And originally, those are sort of tied with each report. And the idea in making the Tyndall working papers is to take out the technical stuff and I'll put it in one and have a much more general, how do you read this report for all of the rest. But if any of the people on the talk want to see one of them, then I'm perfectly happy to share them. And
Okay, great.
for Norwich, the detailed report for the species was published in Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society a year ago.
Okay, Jeff, thanks for that. That was great. We just had a couple of questions through so far. So question number one, this analysis is pretty impressive, and I was wondering what response you may be getting from government or the environmental NGOs, for instance, such as DEFRA and RSPB.
All right, so some of the work along the reports line, we actually did as a contract for World Wildlife Fund UK, looking at the priority places overall. So they have that data which they can work off of. That has re-triggered interest on the part of, say, WWF US, who specifically wanted to know what's going on in Namibia. The Indian government before COVID, before the lockdown happened, and literally the day before I was supposed to leave for India, I was advised by epidemiologists not to go, and it was a very wise decision, or I'd still be stuck there. And I was going to be working with the Wildlife Institute of India and helping them use this data to design a post-2020 protected area network for India. So the Indian government is very interested in where to expand their protected area network, and they want to work with this data. The Brazilian government, pre-Bolsonaro, so it's hard to know where it will go in the future, is working with one of my PhD students who's finishing now, who's been working with Brazil and looking at what might happen in the various parts of Brazil and which parts to restore there as well. And there's been scattering interest here and there, particularly with DFID. When I gave this talk in DFID back in January, again, on how do we prioritize where we might want to do restoration activities. The wildlife trusts are also interested now in looking at this overall in various ways, and particularly in how well can we tie this to carbon. So using the soil carbon maps from WCMC, Holly Gibbs map, and others to try to figure out where is high carbon and how does that fit in with the Refugia and with wildlife trust properties.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. I hope that answers your question, whoever asked that. Question number 2, when you're looking at the projected hospitable habitats for plants and insects, one must consider that this would affect agricultural crops, pollinators, and livestock and plant pests. So what implications does this research have for the farming sector, and are you seeing any interest and/or response from the private sector to this analysis?
I generally don't think the private sector knows about it. It's something that we need to pay more attention to, perhaps by publishing in like farm journals and things. We have a very crude map that we've generated where we made a list of which crops require which types of pollinators and did an overlay showing crops that require pollination and potential pollinator loss. So we can show that. Haven't done much with it simply because it's surprisingly difficult to get a consistent list of plants that absolutely require pollination. Because if you look at something like blueberry, for example, wild blueberry requires pollination, whereas the blueberries we go and buy at Waitrose right now doesn't. So, in cases like apple, you can get by with lower yields if you don't have pollinators. So while you can find a list on Wikipedia, for example, that says here are all the pollinators, it's more difficult to say overall how does that change. When you look at making a map that actually shows simultaneously flowering plants versus pollinators, that you're a little bit more comfortable about because it's more general. You know that most flowering plants require insect pollination as opposed to grasses which are usually wind pollinated, for example. We have looked at some individual pests, particularly looking at, for example, ash dieback, but what you can show is with our models is how that might change in the future where it is and how it might change in the future to where it might disperse to naturally. But the issue there is not where it might disperse to naturally, but where people might move pests to. And at the moment, it's part of the models, but we don't have a way actually to put it out where people can see that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's all the questions I have my end. So Jo, have you been monitoring the questions coming through the chat?
Yeah, so I've got a couple more now. So the first question these are slightly more technical. So the first one was around, you use a 50% suitability threshold for an area to function as a refuge. I think you touched on this, but not all species are equal, e.g. between widespread generalists and more narrowly distributed specialists. How does your model take account of this?
Right, so the 50% suitability threshold is simply numbers of climate models in agreement. So our threshold as to whether it's a refuge or not is always 75% to capture both widespread species and less widespread species. We only fall back on that 50% of climate models when we are combining data. So when you can't look at within GIS, you have to make certain decisions to be able to add up areas or to be able to multiply areas through. You can, however, look at species richness. You can look at within the data, we can do Refugia not only for just plants, but we can look at certain types of plants. We can look at specific genera, and you can get down to looking at specific species. The modeling per se, because our threshold was 20 km, is not going to capture extreme endemics, nor is it going to capture very rare species overall. So, but it's a little bit better than just widespread. So we don't per se in the data that I've shown here show that difference, but it is possible to interrogate the data in a way that would give you some of those measures. And my student that I talked about is actually looking at, we use the 75% threshold to allow us to look at number of climate models in agreement, but you can take any threshold you want as species richness remaining, but it's going to be for the ensemble, or basically half the models, or the 10th or 90th percentile. So you could look at a 40% threshold or a 75% threshold or a 60% threshold or a 50% threshold. You'll just have less data on the uncertainty side.
Thanks, Jeff. And the next question. In your analyses, you have compared the potential of land as refugia and then excluded agricultural areas as not currently acting as refugia. Clearly not all agricultural land use is the same. Can you say whether different agricultural systems offer greater potential than others? I'm thinking maybe agroforestry or small-scale peasant-style farming offer more refugia potential than large-scale intensive agriculture.
It's something you could look at within the framework of whether you have better data. So the data we work off for land cover is the satellite-derived land cover data at 300 meters, which for the UK is 100 meters, the CORIN. But if you're using ESA data, you're limited to how the different ways they classify agriculture. Areas that are agroforestry tend to come across as forested in the satellite data, and that we know that there are some areas where experts can look at it and say, well, okay, this is showing it as natural, but in fact, it's really agroforestry. Or in the case of oil palm, it may come across as being forest when it's actually not useful forest, so it works both ways. Small scale farming, if it's embedded in a natural landscape because the spatial resolution is 300 meters, then that whole area is just going to show as a whole bunch of small pixels that might be farmland. You can break it down though as to type of farmland. So, there's classifications where it's essentially all farmland, it's irrigated farmland, it's rain-fed cropland, it's less than 50% crops, which we keep anything that's less than 50% agriculture as being natural. And if it's greater than 50% agriculture, it's not natural. But 50%, you get that borderline. Anytime you have to make a decision, you're not exactly sure which way it's going to go. And so on a map, I can show that as being partially shaded, partially opaque. When you actually do a quantitative analysis, you have to make the decision it either is or isn't. But if you have data for an area, a province, a district, you could actually then overlay that data, that higher resolution agriculture data, and say, well, what kind of farmland? You could look, for example, in Ethiopia, and you could say how much of this area that would ideally be restored is marginal farmland, and how much is highly productive farmland. And by marginal, I just mean marginal from whatever threshold you want to use. It could be marginal from a GDP point of view, or it could be marginal simply because even smallholder farmers are having a difficult time maintaining a livelihood on it. If that's the case, if this is marginal land, then coming up with some way of paying the farmer to do restoration, they might actually get more money per hectare than they would by growing a crop in marginal situations. So this is a case of the data are there and happy to work with other people, but you're now getting to a fairly refined small scale area where you need other data sets. I tend to work with global data sets, but we can work with local data sets to answer local questions.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. Deanna, I'm just going to unmute you. We've got a little bit of a lull in the questions. I think you've blown lots of people's minds. So I wondered, Deanna, did you have a preference for any of the maps you'd like to see from Jeff? And then we can move on to those and have a look at some other examples.
Actually, I had a question
Go ahead.
regarding the data, Jeff. I was wondering, are there significant data gaps that if you had some extra research money, for instance, would you direct the money toward filling those? What would be your priority with regard to facilitating this type of research or refining it?
Globally, it'd be on insects, particularly pollinators. So while we present results for insects, we present results for pollinators, it's rather patchy compared to some other taxa. So you've got pretty good data from any place with developed agricultural systems. Most of Western Europe, the UK data is great. Not even all of the US data is that great. It's patchy. Brazil is fair in places and non-existent in other places. You have data from South Africa, but other parts of Africa, you have less data. Australia, most of your data comes from along the coast. And so given the importance of pollinators, given the likelihood that pollinators are at least would seem to be more sensitive to climate change than other taxa, having more data on where pollinators are found would be ideal. But I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay, no, but that's very interesting. The other question I had, I'm afraid I'm hogging the questions, but it's quite fascinating to me. The other question I had was, you've done the work on chocolate. Are there other major trade commodities such as coffee, et cetera, that you've done work on?
Yeah, we've looked at anything that we have. Well, we've done it two different ways. So anything that we have, quote, natural data on, that would be in GBIF, which is where we source the occurrence data. So and then, so we have coffee, we have tea. Incidentally, many of the major tea growing regions become less suitable for growing tea, but if you wanted to know where to grow tea in the future, I'd look into Oregon in the US. So Stash Tea may be able to source their tea more locally in the future than they do now. Macadamia, we looked at obviously for Australia, and there's multiple species of macadamia, all of which shift their range. So many of the areas where you grow macadamia will become more difficult to grow them in the future. Many of the nut crops, we have cotton, pineapple, but people will often have moved things other places, and we may not, in some cases, we might actually have data from outside of where it's more native, because people have moved the crop around and the data is ended up in GBIF. We also have used very similar techniques and done essentially maxent species distribution modeling on range maps of crops. So the same sort of range maps for all of the major crops that feed into the AgMIP project, the Agricultural Model and Comparison Project. We've now run those as well and projected at the same spatial scale and projected them to see how those ranges might change. And we've done a different set of statistical models around yield. I tend to avoid, while we model things like maize and wheat and rice, in large part because agencies might ask us to, there's so many of those models out there covering so many different varieties that why use another set of models? You start getting into things like cassava or, even more esoteric crops. Then I think this is useful for what I would call subsistence crops, the sorts of things that are only grown in certain areas that are more for people and for local consumption than they are for import-export trade. But we've done all the berries, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, cherries, using the same modeling technique.
Okay, then the next question is, do you see a future conflict between where people may want to move crops and where the wildlife may want to move? Have you compared those two sort of destination areas?
Yes and no. So when we started this project, we were working with CIOT, the Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia. And they used a set of maps using EcoCrop, so the FAO crop parameters. And we did note, particularly in northern Kenya, the likelihood that many commercially valuable crops from southern Kenya could move into northern Kenya, that area was projected to actually become wetter. And we were concerned about the ethics of putting that data out there, the crop data, not the biodiversity data, for the high risk of land grabs, given that there's model uncertainty. It all depends on what direction the climate models actually go. Other parts of the world, however, for a project we're wrapping up with Bayes right now on a paper on drought, what I found is that current agricultural areas in many countries, but not all, tend to be less prone to drought, and this is meteorological drought, so SPEI, than natural areas do. And as you project into the future, the drought probabilities actually go up. So moving agriculture into areas that are currently natural actually becomes not as successful because they're already they already have higher climate variability, and that climate variability increases in the future. So you have more likelihood of crop failures. So yes, at first we were very concerned about moving and that crops were going to have to move, and there is not enough attention paid on future growing regions of many crops within many of the model intercomparison projects. It's simply, can you keep growing them now there? But when you start bringing in extreme events, you may not be able to move the crops into some of the areas anyway. A bigger concern is actually biofuels and a big move towards bioenergy crops, because you could then select different energy crops that could grow in that area. And now you're looking at a three-pronged competition for land between biodiversity, energy crop, and food. And under those circumstances, biodiversity is almost always going to be the loser, even with the various treaties, because treaties like Rio, the Convention on Biological Diversity, tend not to carry as much weight as UNFCCC. So from that, we developed a term, Article 2 compliance mitigation, to apply to things like energy crops, that just as you're trying to mitigate the climate change to avoid impacts to food systems and to biodiversity at 2 degrees, you don't want the mitigation to impact food systems or biodiversity either. Otherwise, you're not accomplishing anything.
Well, I think I should not dominate the conversation anymore, but I've certainly enjoyed this presentation, and I see lots of potential for exciting new things to do and how to apply this information. So I look forward to contacting you again in the future, Jeff, and probably with different hats on.
All right.
So I think, yeah, we'll call it to a close then. And thank you again very much. It was a fascinating presentation, and I will pass on, this is being recorded. And so I know there were some people who were not able to attend because they had to attend other meetings. So this presentation will be shared around, and you may well get some other comments and queries back from colleagues that were not able to attend this presentation. So again,
Well,
thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Take
Jeff.
care.